You pick up Dostoevsky. 200 pages in and your brain feels alive. You grab a bestseller from this year and 30 pages later you feel nothing. No spark, no depth. Why does an 1846 Russian novel make your thoughts race while a 2024 release feels like watching paint dry? Overthinkers do not read the same way other people do. Research published in Psychology Today in January 2025 shows that people high in need for cognition, a personality trait measuring the tendency to engage in and enjoy effortful thinking, process text differently than those low in this trait. They score higher on measures of analytical thinking and actively seek complexity and nuance. Their brains crave substance. When you hand them a simple narrative with straightforward prose, their cognitive machinery underperforms. They need friction. They need sentences that make them stop and untangle syntax. They need ambiguity that forces multiple reads. Old literature delivers this in ways modern books often cannot. The numbers tell part of the story. Charles Dickens wrote monthly installments averaging 18,500 words each. A typical Dickens novel from the Victorian era ran 357,000 words. Bleak House hit 360,000. By contrast, research from the Dragonfly's gaze-analyzing sentence length from 1840 to 1920 found that English literature averaged 25 words per sentence in the mid-1800s. By 1920, that number dropped to just below 20 words per sentence. Contemporary fiction today? The New York Times reported in 2022 that the average bestseller is half as long as it was in 2011. Smashwords data from the same year showed romance novels decreased by 20,000 words since 2012. The novella is now the fastest growing fiction form. Modern readers want speed, overthinkers want depth. Victorian sentences were not designed for skimming. Take this from George Eliot's Middlemarch, published in 1871. A sentence could run 60 words with embedded clauses, subordinate phrases, and qualifications that demanded you hold multiple ideas in working memory simultaneously. Research on syntactic complexity from the University of Edinburgh in 2012 found that object-extracted relative clauses and center-embedded structures increase processing load significantly. These structures were common in 19th century prose. They forced the reader to maintain syntactic dependencies across long distances. Gibson's dependency locality. Theory from 1998 showed that integrating a newly input phrase with a previous category becomes harder as intervening material increases. Overthinkers thrive on this difficulty. Study after study links need for cognition to preferences for complex tasks. Cacioppo and Petty introduced the construct in 1982. Their research, refined through decades and cited in a 2018 study published in Assessment and validated across multiple countries, shows that high need for cognition individuals prefer complex number-circling tasks over simple ones, achieve higher grade point averages, and demonstrate greater persistence on difficult problems. They find cognitively demanding work inherently enjoyable. Low need for cognition individuals only scrutinize arguments when motivated by external factors like an untrustworthy source or a surprising position. When a high need for cognition reader encounters a Victorian novel, something clicks. The syntactic density matches their processing preference. Research from 2024 published in Calabra Psychology, examining literary versus popular fiction, found that literary fiction has significantly greater lexical and syntax complexity than popular fiction. The study analyzed 100 novels that were National Book Award finalists or winners, and 103 New York Times bestsellers from 2000 to 2020. Using natural language processing, researchers measured average dependency distance and closeness centrality. Literary fiction scored higher on both. Average dependency distance represents the distance between words that govern syntactic dependence and their dependent words. Closeness centrality estimates words between a given word and its main verb. More distance equals more complexity. Old literature forces you to think before you understand. Consider sentence structure across eras. Modernist fiction from the early 20th century employed fragmented narratives and stream of consciousness, but it still maintained high syntactic complexity in different ways. James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, uses interior monologue that mirrors the continuous flow of thought. Virginia Woolf's Misses. Dalloway from 1925 layers psychological depth through complex temporal shifts and free indirect discourse. These techniques demand active cognitive engagement. The reader must track whose consciousness they are inhabiting, parse time shifts, and infer unstated connections. Contemporary fiction prizes, clarity and accessibility. Writers are told to avoid complex sentences. Writing guides from the past decade emphasize short paragraphs, punchy dialogue, simple syntax. The advice is consistent. Do not make readers work. Anne R. Allen, a best-selling mystery author and writing instructor, wrote in 2017 that nobody is looking for war and peace anymore. She noted that readers think in pages while writers obsess over word count because formatting and content vary, but the core message is clear. Contemporary readers want faster, shorter, simpler. Overthinkers find this unsatisfying. Research on reading and social cognition, published in PMC in 2016, examined how fiction reading enhances theory of mind. The study used functional neuroimaging while participants read literary passages varying along two dimensions: vivid versus abstract, and social versus non-social. Results showed distinct subnetworks of the default network respond to these dimensions. The medial temporal lobe subnetwork responded preferentially to vivid passages with or without social content. The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex subnetwork responded preferentially to passages with social and abstract content. Literary fiction excels at creating abstract social scenarios that require inference and mental simulation. Old literature is built on inference. Take ambiguity. Shakespeare's Hamlet, written around 1600, remains the most analyzed play in English literature precisely because of its ambiguity. When Hamlet tells Ophelia to get to a nunnery, the word nunnery had two meanings in Elizabethan England: a convent or a brothel. Scholars debate which Hamlet intended. The ambiguity is structural, not accidental. It forces readers to consider Hamlet's mental state, his view of Ophelia, his feelings about purity and corruption. The text does not resolve it. Modern fiction tends to resolve ambiguity. Publishers and editors push for clarity. Readers raised on visual media expect immediate understanding. A 2022 study on contemporary fiction noted that language is simple and direct, with brief scenes and fragmented chronology serving accessibility rather than complexity. Narrative ambiguity, where plot points or character motivations remain unclear, has become rarer outside literary fiction. Even within literary fiction, commercial pressures encourage resolution. Overthinkers need room to interpret, and the personality trait that drives this need appears consistently across research. A 2025 study from Cognition Today found that people high in need for cognition tend to show more mental activity than physical activity. Under time constraints, low need for cognition, people choose activities requiring physical engagement. High need for cognition individuals choose mental engagement. This extends to reading. They select texts that demand cognitive effort. One study referenced in the Cognition Today article showed that those who put effort into analyzing details tend to have worse moods than those observing superficial details, suggesting that overthinking has costs. But for high need for cognition individuals, the cognitive satisfaction outweighs mood costs. They would rather think deeply and feel challenged than feel briefly cheerful from easy content. Old literature provides endless opportunities for deep analysis. Consider the layers in a single Dickens character. Miss Havisham, from Great Expectations, published in 1861, is not simply a jilted bride. Her psychology intertwines with Victorian attitudes toward women, property, revenge, class, and time. Dickens never explicitly states her internal logic. Readers infer it from her actions, her environment, the rotting wedding cake, the stopped clocks. Dickens trusted readers to construct meaning. Modern bestsellers often explain everything. Contemporary writing advice emphasizes showing, not telling, but in practice this means visual description replacing inference. Characters state their feelings. Motivations are spelled out. Subtext has diminished. Research on Victorian literature confirms its complexity. A study examining novels from 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria, found that the novel became the leading literary genre. Production increased from 100 new novels per year at the start to 1,000 by the end. These were thickly plotted, crowded with characters, long and realistic. They depicted contemporary life, but with psychological depth and social critique. Charles Dickens focused on wealth disparity and humanizing the working class. Thomas Hardy questioned religion and social structures. Elizabeth Barrett Browning tackled child labor. The Victorian novel was never simple entertainment. Sentence construction reflected this ambition. A Georgetown blog analyzing The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, published in 1868, noted the novel runs 194,000 words. Complexity was structural. Multiple narrators, shifting perspectives, delayed revelations. Collins pioneered the sensation novel, which combined melodrama with psychological realism. The format required readers to track contradictory accounts and infer truth. Overthinkers excel at tracking contradictions. The correlation between overthinking and need for cognition appears in clinical research. A 2025 study in Journal of Adult Development examining cognitive growth in adulthood found that reading practices requiring metacognition and comprehension monitoring correlate with sustained cognitive development. Adults who engage with complex texts maintain higher cognitive function. Need for cognition predicts this engagement. It also predicts anxiety. Research from Clarity Health in October 2025, examining the anxiety intelligence paradox, found that verbal intelligence correlates with worry and rumination. Patients with generalized anxiety disorder often score higher on verbal intelligence tests. The same analytical abilities that enable insight also fuel overthinking. This creates a specific reading preference. Old literature offers what psychologists call tolerance for ambiguity. Research shows that tolerating ambiguity is essential for creativity and open-mindedness. People who demand clear answers struggle with texts that refuse to provide them. Overthinkers, despite their tendency toward anxiety, often have high tolerance for conceptual ambiguity, even as they struggle with decision-making ambiguity. They can hold multiple interpretations simultaneously. They enjoy the cognitive challenge of weighing evidence for different readings. Victorian novels provide exactly this. Ambiguity appears in characterization. Is Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, published in 1847, a Byronic hero or a villain? Emily Bronte gives evidence for both. Readers must decide. Is Becky Sharp in Thackeray's Vanity Fair, published in 1848, admirably resourceful or morally bankrupt? The text supports multiple views. Modern fiction often signals how readers should feel about characters. Moral frameworks are clearer. Anti-heroes are labeled as such. Readers are guided toward interpretations. If you value documented literary history and psychological research like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from psychology. Today's January 2025 publication on the strengths of overthinkers, authored by Alice Boyes, who holds a PhD and translates principles from cognitive behavioral therapy and social psychology, and from Collabra Psychology's January 2024. Meta-analysis on need for cognition and well-being, examining 192 participants across clinical and non-clinical groups with full measurement invariance confirmed. Now back to the information. The shift in sentence structure from a 19th century to contemporary is measurable. Research analyzing Project Gutenberg texts found that average sentence length decreased from 25 words in 1840 to below 20 words by 1920. This trend continued. Contemporary fiction averages even shorter. A 2022 article from Writing Workshops examining modern literary sentences noted that while some authors like David Mitchell and Zadie Smith use long, complex sentences, the dominant trend favors brevity. Hemingway's influence persists: short, declarative sentences, minimal subordination, direct meaning. For overthinkers, this feels intellectually thin. The cognitive load required to parse a Victorian sentence activates the prefrontal cortex differently than simple sentences. A PMC study on neural mechanisms underlying complex sentence processing used fMRI to measure brain activity while participants processed sentences with different syntactic complexity. Complex object initial sentences showed increased activity in left inferior frontal and temporal regions. Complex adjunct initial sentences showed increased activity in occipital and right superior frontal regions. Different complex structures recruit different brain networks. Canonical simple sentences showed different patterns. When you read a 40-word Dickens sentence with multiple embedded clauses, your brain works harder. For overthinkers, this is satisfying. Need for cognition also predicts how people respond to persuasive messages. Research from the original Cacioppo and Petty studies in the 1980s found that high need for cognition individuals analyze argument quality regardless of source credibility. They distinguish between strong and weak arguments, whether the source is trustworthy or not. Low need for cognition. Individuals only scrutinize messages from untrustworthy sources, or when arguments are surprising. This suggests fundamental differences in cognitive engagement. Applied to reading, high need for cognition. Readers evaluate textual quality. Independent of author reputation or genre expectations, they engage deeply with structure, language, and ideas regardless of context. A complex old text receives the cognitive attention it demands. A simple modern text, regardless of marketing or cultural buzz, fails to engage their analytical systems. The numbers support this. Research on literary versus popular fiction from 2024 found that exposure to literary fiction correlates with enhanced social cognition and theory of mind. Multiple studies spanning from 2006 to 2010 found that readers of fiction score higher on empathy and theory of mind measures than non-readers, controlling for age, gender, intelligence, and personality. Developmental work with children aged 4 to 6 showed that exposure to juvenile fiction predicted better theory of mind task performance, again, controlling for age, gender, vocabulary, and parental income. The mechanism appears to be that literary fiction with psychological complexity and ambiguity exercises the default network involved in theory of mind. Old literature is psychologically complex almost by definition. Victorian realism, the dominant mode from roughly 1860 to 1900, prioritized psychological realism alongside social realism. George Eliot's novels explore interior consciousness. Her narrator in Middlemarch provides psychological analysis of characters that reads like modern psychotherapy. Published serially from 1871 to 1872, Middlemarch presents Dorothea Brooke's idealism, Tertius Lydgate's ambition, and the Provincial Society's constraining effect on both. Eliot does not moralize simply, she shows psychological mechanisms. Readers observe how Dorothea's desire for meaningful work leads her to marry pedantic Casaubon, and how her intelligence ultimately recognizes the mistake. Contemporary fiction often externalizes psychology. Characters experience events, they react. But the deep excavation of motive, the analysis of how past shapes present, the careful tracing of cause and effect in emotional life appears less frequently. Partly, this reflects changing narrative modes. Stream of consciousness and free indirect discourse, modernist innovations, allowed psychological depth without Victorian omniscient narration. But contemporary minimalism often sacrifices psychological complexity for surface clarity. Overthinkers notice this absence. They are drawn to texts that mirror their own mental processes. Research from the 2018 study validating the 6-item need for cognition scale found that need for cognition correlates positively with openness to experience, moderately with conscientiousness, particularly competence and achievement-striving facets, and inversely with neuroticism. It relates negatively to harm avoidance and positively to persistence. These are traits that predict engagement with challenging material. Overthinkers persist when others quit. They find value in difficult texts that others find frustrating. Old literature rewards persistence. Take Moby Dick, published in 1851. Herman Melville's novel opens with cetology chapters that many modern readers skip. These chapters catalog whale species, whaling techniques, historical accounts. They seem digressive, but they serve thematic purposes. The encyclopedic impulse reflects Ahab's obsessive desire to categorize and control nature. The whaling details ground the metaphysical quest in physical reality. Melville trusted readers to make these connections. He built a structure that demands active interpretation. Modern publishing would likely cut those chapters. The economic pressures on contemporary publishing push toward accessibility. Advances go to books with clear market appeal. Editors pressure authors to simplify. The average reader, publishers argue, wants plot-driven narratives with clear arcs and satisfying resolutions. This is not entirely wrong. Most readers do prefer this, but most readers are not overthinkers. Research on need for cognition shows it follows a normal distribution. Most people fall in the middle. A minority score very high. Another minority scores very low. Publishing targets the middle. Old literature, written before mass market publishing, could target the high end without commercial penalty. Authors wrote for educated readers who valued complexity. The rise of serialization in magazines expanded audiences, but maintained intellectual standards. Dickens serialized in All the Year Round, Eliot in Blackwood's Magazine. These were not niche publications, but they assumed reader intelligence. Contemporary publishing assumes readers want ease. The result is a mismatch between what overthinkers need and what modern books provide. They turn to old literature by default, not from nostalgia or elitism, but from cognitive hunger. A 2025 article from Psychology. Today on Overthinking Types identified 5 categories. The maximizer, driven by achievement and optimization. The squirrel, distracted by multiple competing thoughts. The ruminator, focused on past mistakes and shame. The forecaster, consumed by future catastrophes. And the overthinker, paralyzed by too many options. Each type benefits from cognitive engagement, but ruminators particularly benefit from texts that redirect analytical energy outward rather than inward. Old literature provides an external object for analysis. Instead of ruminating on personal failures, the overthinker can analyze why Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, murders the pawnbroker. Dostoevsky provides psychological depth that matches the ruminator's natural inclination to ask why. The novel examines guilt, rationalization, redemption, and the limits of utilitarian ethics. It is a philosophical novel wrapped in psychological realism. Every page offers material for analysis. Reading it channels overthinking into textual interpretation rather than self-criticism. Modern thrillers provide plot. Old literature provides psychology. The difference matters cognitively. Research from Springer, examining need for cognition and well-being in 2024, found that higher need for cognition associates with lower neuroticism, anxiety, negative affect, burnout, public self-consciousness and depression, and with higher positive affect, private self-consciousness and satisfaction. These correlations cluster around 0.20 with confidence intervals, excluding 0. Need for cognition appears protective against certain psychological risks, possibly because it channels cognitive energy productively. Reading complex literature may function as a healthy cognitive outlet, but only if the literature is actually complex. Victorian novels, Russian literature from the 19th century, French realism from the same period, modernist fiction from the early 20th century all share structural complexity. Sentences demand parsing. Characters resist simple categorization. Themes layer. Symbolism requires interpretation. These features align with overthinking cognitive style. Contemporary fiction, even when literary, often prioritizes different values. Emotional immediacy, cultural relevance, diverse voices, these are important. But they do not necessarily correlate with syntactic complexity or interpretive ambiguity. A contemporary literary novel might explore important social issues through straightforward prose and clear characterization. It can be excellent literature while failing to satisfy the cognitive itch that overthinkers experience. This creates a reading ecosystem where overthinkers return again and again to old books. They reread. Research on rereading shows that high need for cognition individuals revisit complex texts to extract additional meaning. They notice details missed initially. They test alternative interpretations. Rereading a Dickens novel, or a George Eliot novel, or a Dostoevsky novel provides fresh insights because the text contains more than can be absorbed in one pass. The density ensures reread value. Modern books designed for a single reading do not reward rereading in the same way. You know the plot. The characters were clearly defined the first time. The themes were stated explicitly. There is little left to discover. Overthinkers need texts that resist complete understanding. This might seem perverse. Why would anyone seek difficulty? The answer lies in the relationship between cognitive load and satisfaction. Research on need for cognition consistently shows that high scores find effortful thinking intrinsically rewarding. They do not avoid difficulty, they seek it. A complex sentence is not an obstacle, but an invitation. An ambiguous character is not a flaw, but a feature. Old literature understands this implicitly. Authors like Henry James, writing from the late 19th century into the early 20th, crafted sentences of extraordinary complexity. The Golden Bowl, published in 1904, contains sentences running 100 words with multiple levels of subordination. James called his late style his major phase, and critics debate whether it represents the pinnacle of psychological realism or excessive obscurity. For overthinkers, it represents pure cognitive engagement. Every sentence requires active parsing. Every character motive requires inference. Modern authors who attempt similar complexity often face editorial resistance. Publishers want accessibility. Book clubs want discussability. Neither requires the kind of syntactic difficulty James employed. The market has changed. Victorian 3-volume novels gave way to single volumes, which gave way to category fiction, which gave way to algorithm-optimized content. Each shift favored faster reading and clearer meaning. For most readers, this is positive. For overthinkers, each shift reduced the available supply of appropriately challenging material. They adapt by reading old books, but this is not purely about age. Some contemporary authors maintain high complexity. Literary fiction still exists. Small presses publish challenging work, but the overthinker must actively seek it. Old literature is reliably complex. You can pick up a George Eliot novel confident it will demand cognitive effort. You cannot make the same assumption about a contemporary novel without research. The search costs are lower for old literature. This has a compound effect. As overthinkers discover that old literature consistently satisfies their cognitive needs, they develop reading habits centered on classics. They build knowledge of 19th century context, which makes reading additional 19th century novels easier and more rewarding. They recognize allusions. They understand historical references. Their investment in old literature creates returns that make further reading in the same period more valuable. Network effects favor old books. Meanwhile, contemporary fiction continues optimizing for median readers. Writing workshops teach Hemingway's iceberg theory. Editors cut anything that slows pace. Readers trained on television and social media expect immediate engagement. The pressure toward simplicity is structural, not conspiratorial. Everyone in the publishing chain responds to market signals. The market signals demand accessibility. Overthinkers are a niche market. Research confirms this. Studies on need for cognition rarely focus on reading preferences specifically, but the broader pattern is clear. High need for cognition individuals constitute a minority. They cluster in certain professions: academia, law, software development, research. They self-select into environments valuing analytical thinking. Their reading preferences reflect their cognitive style, but publishing cannot profitably target them exclusively. Old literature solved this accidentally by being written before mass markets existed. Authors in the 19th century wrote for educated audiences. Literacy was lower, but among the literate, educational standards were high. Classical education included Greek and Latin. Readers had cultural knowledge, assuming familiarity with Bible, Shakespeare, Milton. Authors could allude without explaining. They could write complex sentences, assuming readers could parse them. Contemporary authors cannot make these assumptions. They write for diverse audiences with varying education levels. Accessibility is both an aesthetic choice and an ethical one. Excluding readers through difficulty raises questions of literary elitism, but accessibility has costs. It reduces the complexity available to readers who want it. Overthinkers pay this cost by turning backward. They read Tolstoy instead of trending titles. They read Proust instead of popular fiction, not from snobbery but from need. The 7 volumes of In Search of Lost Time, published from 1913 to 1927, provide inexhaustible material for analysis. Proust's sentences run pages. His psychological insight rivals psychoanalytic case studies. His attention to memory, perception, social dynamics, art, and time creates layers of meaning that reward multiple readings. No contemporary bestseller offers comparable density. This does not mean contemporary literature is inferior. It means it serves different readers. Most readers want engaging stories they can finish and discuss. They want plots that resolve, characters they understand, language that does not impede comprehension. These are reasonable desires. Publishing serves them well. But overthinkers want something else. They want sentences that require rereading. They want characters who remain somewhat mysterious. They want thematic complexity that resists summary. They want books that feel like intellectual puzzles requiring sustained attention to solve. Old literature provides this consistently. Modern literature provides it occasionally in specific subgenres, from specific authors through specific publishers. The path of least resistance leads overthinkers to old books. One final factor amplifies this: cultural prestige. Reading classics carries social capital that reading bestsellers does not. Overthinkers, often high in conscientiousness and achievement orientation according to need for cognition research, respond to prestige incentives. Saying you read Middlemarch signals intellectual seriousness in ways that reading a thriller does not. This is not the primary motivation. Cognitive fit matters more, but prestige reinforces the pattern. Old literature offers both cognitive satisfaction and social validation. Modern literary fiction offers some of both, but competes with genre fiction, which offers neither. The overthinker choosing between a literary novel from 2024 and Bleak House from 1853 faces a calculation. The contemporary novel might be good, but requires research to confirm quality. Bleak House is guaranteed complex, carries cultural prestige, and costs less due to public domain status. The economics favor Dickens. Digital libraries make this easier. Project Gutenberg provides free access to thousands of old books. Overthinkers can download Victorian novels without cost. Contemporary novels cost $15 to $30. The price difference matters when you read voraciously, but more importantly, the digital availability makes discovering old literature frictionless. Searching for complex novels yields lists of classics. Algorithms recommend Tolstoy if you liked Dostoevsky. The recommendation systems work better for old literature. Contemporary algorithms trained on reading data learn that people who read one classic read others. They cluster Victorian novelists together. They group Russian authors. They identify patterns in reader behavior. Overthinkers who pick up one old book get recommended others. The system reinforces their preferences through positive feedback loops. Meanwhile, the algorithm struggles to recommend modern equivalents because the market for high-complexity contemporary fiction is smaller and more scattered. This technological reality shapes reading patterns. Overthinkers find more old books recommended to them. They discover that old books satisfy their needs. They read more old books. The cycle continues. But underneath all this, underneath the market forces and technological mediation and social incentives, sits the fundamental reason. Old literature matches how overthinkers think. The sentences mirror their mental syntax. The characters reflect their psychological complexity. The ambiguity matches their comfort with multiple interpretations. The depth rewards their willingness to invest cognitive effort. Reading old literature feels like coming home. It feels like finding writing that respects their intelligence, that assumes they can handle difficulty, that trusts them to make connections without authorial guidance, that values ideas and psychology and language craft alongside plot. Modern publishing, optimized for accessibility, sacrifices some of this, not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. When you write for everyone, you cannot write for overthinkers specifically. The median reader determines the product. Overthinkers, being non-median, find their needs unmet. They solve this by reading books written before median readers shaped publishing. Here's what we found in the records that reframes everything. A 2024 computational linguistics study analyzing 800 English novels from 1800 to 2000 found that lexical diversity, measured by type-token ratio, peaked in the 1860s. It has declined continuously since. The most diverse Victorian novels used 4 times as many unique words per thousand compared to contemporary bestsellers. Not 4% more, 4 times more. This represents a fundamental shift in linguistic complexity that cannot be explained by style preference alone. The vocabulary available in old literature creates semantic richness that modern books lack structurally. Your brain knows the difference. It feels it in every sentence. The historical context matters too. When Dickens wrote Bleak House, he assumed readers would spend hours with each monthly installment. Reading was entertainment, education, and social currency combined. Families read aloud together. Dinner conversations analyzed plot developments. Cultural literacy meant knowing current serializations. This reading environment rewarded attention and retention. Authors could plant details in Chapter 3 that paid off in Chapter 47, trusting readers would remember. Contemporary publishing assumes readers might not finish books. Authors front-load hooks. Each chapter ends with minor cliffhangers. Important information gets repeated. The assumption is partial attention and possible abandonment. This changes narrative architecture fundamentally. Overthinkers notice this architecture. They recognize when authors do not trust their attention. They feel patronized by repeated information. They want narratives that reward sustained focus. Old literature, written for sustained reading, provides this inherently. The structure assumes you will remember. It builds slowly. It trusts your intelligence. Modern structure assumes you might be distracted. This difference appears in narrative pacing. Victorian novels often spend chapters on character development before significant plot events. Modern writing advice suggests starting with action. Grab readers immediately. Establish stakes fast. This creates different reading experiences. The Victorian approach allows gradual immersion. You enter the fictional world slowly, learning its rules and characters before major conflicts emerge. The modern approach throws you into conflict immediately. For most readers, immediate conflict is engaging. For overthinkers, gradual immersion allows deeper connection. They want to understand characters thoroughly before those characters face crises. They want to know the social world completely before watching it disrupted. The slow Victorian pace matches their preference for comprehensive understanding before judgment. Research on reading comprehension supports this. Studies show that readers who spend more time on initial exposition have better comprehension of complex narratives. They build richer mental models of the story world. Overthinkers naturally read this way. They prefer texts that reward their reading style. Old literature was written for people who read carefully. The vocabulary difference compounds this. The 2024 study showing Victorian novels used 4 times more unique words per thousand is staggering. This is not minor variation. This represents fundamentally different lexical richness. When George Eliot writes, she draws from a vocabulary cultivated by classical education. She uses words from Greek, Latin, French, German origins. She employs precise technical terms from medicine, law, theology, philosophy. Her readers had education to match. Contemporary authors write for readers with varied educational backgrounds. Using rare words risks alienating readers. Editors flag vocabulary above certain grade levels. The result is lexical compression. Authors express complex ideas using simpler vocabularies. This is a craft skill, making do with less, but it reduces semantic precision. Overthinkers feel this reduction. When you have the vocabulary to distinguish between chagrin, mortification, humiliation, and embarrassment, seeing them all rendered as felt bad is cognitively unsatisfying. Old literature gives you the precise word. It assumes you know it or will look it up. It does not dumb down. This relates to another overthinker characteristic. They tend to be voracious learners. Need for cognition correlates with educational attainment and with interest in acquiring knowledge across domains. Reading old literature becomes a learning experience. You encounter unfamiliar words and look them up. You meet historical references and research them. You find philosophical concepts and explore them. The text becomes a gateway to broader learning. Modern fiction, even when excellent, rarely functions this way. It explains what you need to know. It provides context. It does not assume you will independently research references. This is reader-friendly, but reduces learning opportunities. Overthinkers want those opportunities. They want to encounter ideas beyond their current knowledge. They want texts that challenge them to grow. Old literature, written before explanatory culture dominated, assumes readers will rise to meet its demands. You do not understand a classical illusion? Learn about classical myth? You do not know Victorian social customs? Study Victorian history. The text will not explain itself. This is the opposite of contemporary hand-holding. Some see this as elitist. Why should literature require external knowledge? Should texts not be self-contained? These are fair questions, but they assume one right way to write and read. For overthinkers, texts that demand research are features, not bugs. They want intellectual breadth. Old literature provides it accidentally. The philosophical depth adds another layer. Victorian novelists engaged seriously with intellectual currents of their time. Darwinism, utilitarianism, industrial capitalism, feminism, imperialism, religious doubt all appear in Victorian fiction as live debates. George Eliot explores determinism versus free will. Thomas Hardy questions divine providence. Elizabeth Gaskell examines class conflict. These are not background elements, but central concerns. Contemporary fiction addresses current issues too, but differently. Social justice themes appear through character experiences rather than philosophical examination. This is often more emotionally immediate, but less intellectually comprehensive. Overthinkers appreciate emotional depth, but also want philosophical rigor. Old literature offers both. Consider how Dostoevsky treats ethics and crime and punishment. Raskolnikov's utilitarian logic justifying murder gets examined from multiple angles: psychological, social, spiritual, philosophical. The novel is a sustained inquiry into whether exceptional individuals can transcend conventional morality. Dostoevsky does not simply show murder's consequences, he philosophically dissects the reasoning that permits it. Modern novels about criminals focus on psychology and consequences. They show damage and trauma. This is valuable, but different from philosophical investigation. Overthinkers want the philosophical dimension. They read fiction not just for story or character, but for ideas. They want novels that think alongside them, that explore concepts rigorously, that take ideas seriously enough to build entire narratives around them. Old literature does this consistently. It was written when novels were considered important intellectual venues. Contemporary literary culture separates fiction from philosophy. We have novels and we have academic philosophy. Rarely do they merge, but Victorian and 19th century continental authors saw no separation. Novels were vehicles for serious thought. This changes how texts feel to overthinkers. Reading Crime and Punishment is an intellectual experience. You're not just following Raskolnikov's story, you are working through ethical philosophy. The narrative makes you confront questions about moral universality, human nature, redemption, and punishment. You finish with ideas to ponder. Reading most contemporary thrillers, you finish with plot closure but no lingering questions. The difference matters to overthinkers because they seek cognitive residue. They want books that continue working in their minds after finishing. They want ideas that generate further thinking. They want ambiguities that prompt continued analysis. Old literature reliably creates this residue. Modern books, designed for satisfying closure, often do not. Research on reader response theory confirms that different readers want different outcomes. Some want escape and closure. Others want provocation and openness. Neither is wrong. But publishing overwhelmingly serves the first group. Overthinkers belong to the second group. They find their needs better met by old books written before the market stratified. The community aspect amplifies this. Old literature has established scholarly communities, online forums, academic resources. You can find someone who has thought deeply about any aspect of any major classic. When you notice a pattern in Middlemarch and find scholarly articles confirming your observation, you feel rewarded. Your attention was justified. The educational system reinforces this. Schools teach classics. Students write papers analyzing them. When overthinkers reread classics as adults, they find new depths in books they first encountered young. Old books have survived. They were good enough that people kept reading them across decades or centuries. This survival signals quality. You know, a classic has lasting value. Contemporary books might be excellent or forgotten in 5 years. Overthinkers, being analytical, calculate this risk. Old books offer proven quality, established community, educational infrastructure, and cognitive challenge. The expected value calculation favors classics. But here is the deeper truth. Old literature reflects a different relationship between reader and text. It was written when reading was scarce. People reread books because they owned few. Authors built in depth to reward rereading. Every element served multiple purposes simultaneously. Contemporary publishing abundance changes this. With unlimited options, authors can specialize. Thrillers maximize plot. Character studies maximize psychology. Books optimize for single dimensions. Overthinkers want everything at once. They want plot that serves theme, character that embodies philosophy, style that enhances meaning. Old literature provides this integration. This integration creates the density overthinkers crave. Modern novels often feel looser. Elements exist for their own sake. Overthinkers notice when elements do not integrate. They want texts where every sentence potentially matters, where background details might be symbolic, where nothing is mere filler. The overthinker's preference for old books is pattern recognition. The patterns in Victorian sentences match patterns in overthinking minds. Philosophical depth matches their need to understand. Ambiguity matches their tolerance for unresolved questions. Vocabulary richness matches their verbal intelligence. Modern simplicity leaves them understimulated. They need the density only old literature consistently provides. Before publishing optimized for median readers, before accessibility became paramount, before word counts shrank and sentences simplified, the match is cognitive. The preference is inevitable. The 2024 computational study, Finding Victorian Novels, used 4 times more unique words per thousand, is not trivial. It represents a structural shift in what literature can be. When you have access to richer vocabulary, you can express finer distinctions. When you can express finer distinctions, you can think more precisely. Reading becomes thinking tool. Old literature makes your brain work differently. It activates more neural regions. It demands higher working memory. It exercises vocabulary. It builds cultural knowledge. It develops tolerance for ambiguity. It strengthens analytical thinking. All traits overthinkers already have but need to use. Modern literature, optimized for ease, does not demand these capacities fully. It can be excellent while asking less cognitively. For most readers, this is welcome. For overthinkers, it is insufficient. They solve this by reading old books, by returning to Tolstoy and Eliot and Dostoevsky and Dickens, by finding in 19th century prose the cognitive challenge their 21st century brains require. And no amount of contemporary accessibility can change what overthinkers need to feel intellectually alive. The market will continue serving median readers. Publishing will continue optimizing for accessibility. Contemporary literature will continue being excellent for most people, but overthinkers will keep reading old books, because old books still speak to how they think, because complexity is not obstacle but invitation, because difficulty is not flaw but feature, because their brains need what old literature provides and modern books often do not. The preference is real. The reason's measurable. The gap widening. Overthinkers are not looking back sentimentally. They look back because history has what they need. The cognitive fit is too perfect, the satisfaction too reliable. So they read on through Victorian triple-deckers and Russian epics, finding in old pages what new books rarely offer, finding minds that think like theirs, finding sentences that challenge, finding ambiguity they can inhabit, finding depth they can explore, finding literature that respects their intelligence and rewards their attention. Old literature provides this. Modern literature sometimes does. The difference determines what overthinkers read. Spine after spine of classics, purchased or downloaded, read and reread, marked and annotated. Because for overthinkers, old literature is ongoing conversation, living dialogue, active engagement. Everything their minds require in contemporary publishing increasingly struggles to provide. The preference is not about age, it is about alignment. Cognitive, intellectual, structural alignment between how these readers think and how these books are made. That alignment, created accidentally by history, remains unmatched intentionally by modernity.